Gabriel-Jones. He's the principal of the Public Plan Consultancy, also previously DSE, and he highlights the 2008 report as a bit of a highlight, which was a review of the management of riparian land in Victoria. So, thank you, David.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Now, how do we get this up and running? We wanted that one, don't we? Good.
Yeah.
Okay, now here's a slide, a picture that keeps recurring through my presentation, and it is indeed a metaphor. And it's a metaphor for the body of law that we're trying to find our way through tonight. So we're thinking about the possibility of a Waterway Management Act, and a lot of my understanding of this issue and a lot of what I have to say tonight goes back to this particular paper that I did for DSE in 2008. And I'm sorry that Peter Bolderberg is not here tonight because he, as the client, my client in doing this work, really takes the credit for having pushed me and urged me and cajoled me through this piece of work to produce this particular report, which you'll find on the web somewhere if you care to download 350 pages. That's what it took to explain what the subject here. In retrospect, one of the changes I would have made to this paper, I would not have called it the management of riparian land. It's not about vegetation and fencing and stocking and erosion and soils. It's about governance. It's about the legal and administrative systems that apply to riparian land. Now, what I want to run through tonight is this little list of things here, not necessarily in that order, but I'm talking about the law, Acts of Parliament and the common law and the sorts of things that Rob was certainly illustrating quite dramatically in his presentation. What is the law related to riparian land? What's wrong with it? How do we fix things that are wrong? What do we expect Parliament to do when we find something that needs to be fixed? And start to speculate anyway on what a piece of legislation might be to fix up these weird situations that Rob's started to introduce us to. First of all, the law, I think, has to be put into a particular perspective. We're not going to change things by changing the law. The law is only one method of fixing things that are wrong. And I'm suggesting that the other two, community attitudes and money. Now, the order of priority of these three things, I've got no particular opinion on. Well, I'm inclined to think that community attitudes is the number one. So changes to the law have to be placed in the context of other changes that we need. When we're thinking about the law, what does the law do? In some cases, the law compels things to happen. In other cases, it prevents things from happening. And in further cases, again, it enables things to happen. So, what tools would we need to, if we were going to have reformed law to deal with riparian issues? What are the issues that need to be fixed? Well, if we go back to the Victorian the River Health Strategy 2002, it had a very succinct account. 3 issues that complicate riparian management, and I think they appear on the next slide. We'll have a little look at the riparian cross-section, and Rob started to introduce us to the elements of the cross-section, the cadastral elements, as against the physical elements of a river's cross-section. 1881 is a key year that we have to remember, and likewise 1905. I think Rob mentioned both of those years. And we have to understand that the body of law we're dealing with is not entirely Acts of Parliament. There are at least a couple of dirty grade slabs of the common law, namely doctrine of accretion, which Rob mentioned, and adverse possession, which he didn't mention.
No, I left that to you.
Yeah, okay, good on you. Right. So, Victorian River Health Strategy 2002, currently being superseded by the next version, makes these excellent observations. 3 issues complicate the management of riparian land. 1, the mismatch between ecological definition and administrative definitions. 2, the varying tenure, and 3, the dynamic nature of rivers. So, these administrative definitions of riparian land, what are they? What's that all about? If you're a geomorphologist or an agricultural scientist or whatever, or a hydrologist, you'll have your own view of what constitutes riparian land, and your definition will be in terms of topography and vegetation and so forth. Sorry, that's not the way that surveyors and lawyers and property managers define riparian land. Their definition is in these sorts of terms. If we look at the Water Act, we find something called waterways, something called designated waterways, something called designated land, which has one meaning for CMAs and a different meaning for Melbourne Water. And some of you guys are from CMAs, aren't you? You'll be reasonably familiar, I would hope, with what the Water Act has to say on the subject. If we turn to the Land Act, we find a definition of something called the Better Banks, and we find the definition of something called a frontage. And they do not line up with the definitions that we just looked at in the Water Act. I won't try to explain what each one of these is. If we look at the Water Industry Act, we find a different thing altogether called waterways land. And finally, if we look at the poor old Heritage Rivers Act, everybody's forgotten that one, haven't they? It's disappeared into the night. We find heritage rivers areas. And of course, what is familiar to a lot of people out there who understand planning schemes, they know about things called UFCs and LSIOs and so forth. So in a sense, all these items that I've got on this slide are administrative definitions of riparian facets of riparian land.
David,
and they do not line up with each other.
We've missed the Crown Land Reserves Act, of course. 1978.
Crown Land Reserves Act.
Permanent reserve along the river?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Now we haven't missed it. We're coming to it.
Good.
Right. Now, the question that we have to ask all through what Rob and I are saying is this: does it matter? You know, the world is full of weird things and complications and things you don't properly understand, but do they need to be fixed? There's a lot of weird things that we just live with. And I am inclined to say that it does matter, that the repercussions of these weird things we're talking about tonight are so profound and have such a bearing on the real world and the management of rivers and the land alongside that it does matter and that they should be fixed. That's my view. I'd be interested to know what your view is. 1881, right. Crown land along how many rivers?
1,500 rivers and waterways.
How did you get that figure?
That's one that's always published, David.
Yeah?
It depends, but you go up them, you know, it depends how many you want to have.
I have to add that out.
It was corrected.
Right. I had an idea it was 280 anyway. So the Crown land along these rivers was permanently reserved. The bed and banks, which are technical terms, and the frontage, which is a technical term, on either side, permanently reserved. Out of this sentence, the word that you need to understand is permanent. What is meant by a permanent reserve? This is something whose status can be changed only by a new site-specific Act of Parliament. Unlike roads which can be closed and opened and all the rest of it under generic legislation, permanent reserve along rivers cannot be. Now, it happened in 1881, which was 40 years too late. Because in the previous 40 years, a whole lot of land up and down Victoria's rivers had already been freeholded. So the 1881 decision applied only to land which was still Crown land in 1881. So there is a myth, a very widespread myth right around the community, that there's a permanent reserve up and down all these rivers. Wrong. Rob showed us some gaps between the edge of the reserve and the abutting freehold. What do we mean? What's the consequences of Crown land being either reserved or unreserved? If it is reserved, then we have the whole apparatus of the Crown land reserves at our disposal. We can appoint committees of management, we can make regulations, and we have a very powerful suite of tools for leasing and licensing. If it's unreserved land, there is no provision whatsoever to appoint a manager. There's no provision for regulations, and there's only the crudest provisions for leases and licences. So this is not just some abstract difference between reserved and unreserved. This has quite profound repercussions. Rivers move, permanent reserves don't. Glenelg River at Balmoral. Here we have another parish plan. Oh, they're wonderful documents, aren't they? Right, yes. And I'm sorry that this is sideways, but it has to be. Now, what can we get out of this one? If we get out our magnifying glass, we can see that Crown Allotment 1 of this parish here was sold off to Mr. D. Robertson, Esquire, 155 acres, something or other. And
2 roofs, 37 birds.
Yeah, very good, thank you, yes. Which you will convert to hectares for us while we... Yeah, right. And we get out our magnifying glass and we see that this happened in 1863. 1863 was before 1881. Good. And in 1863, everybody believed, that the riparian boundaries went to the centre line of the river. So Mr. D. Robertson's title went to the centre line of the Glenelg River. Next, we get 1881, permanently reserved 150 links. Quick conversion, please.
30 metres.
30 metres, thank you.
30.18.
So along the Glenelg River, 1881, we get a permanent reserve of the bed and the banks and the frontages either side. But it did not undo the grant which had already been given to Mr. D. Robertson, Esquire. His land still goes to the centre line of the river. Next date here, 84, right, 1884. So the surveyor comes along in 1884 to set out Crown Allotment 36 and knows he cannot go inside the permanent reserve. He's got to keep 150 links away from the river, and here indeed, here's our freehold land, and here indeed is a band of Crown land along the Glenelg River, which is at least 150 links wide. Does this matter?
What's the link? Well, 201168 of a metre. Thereabouts.
Thank you. 100 links is a chain. 100 links is a chain, and a chain is 20 metres.
Yeah. And you
in dealing with riparian land, we'll hear the terms one chain, 1.5 chains, 3 chains, meaning 20, 30 and 60 metres.
Yeah.
Near enough. Yeah. If you want the 4th decimal point, we'll give you a nice explainer here. Does it matter? I'll tell you, yes, it does matter. The gentleman who now owns this piece of land was arrested last year by the local constabulary and charged with the criminal offence of damaging fences, which had been paid for by the CMA. He was convicted in the magistrate's court of the criminal offence of malicious damage. He had to go to the Supreme Court to be exonerated. What had gone wrong? The police, informed by the CMA, which had been informed by GSC, did not understand what I have just told you. Between them all, they believed that there was a permanent reserve along the entire length of the Glenelg River, which there is not. Does it matter? You ask the farmer, right, who had the handcuffs put on him, whether it matters. Moving up to Warburton here. So here we are at Britannia Creek, Warburton. We get exactly the same sort of annotation here. Crown lands forming the bed banks, blah, 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 150 links, blah, blah, blah. Gazette number such and such of 1881. And here we see the bed banks and the band either side. The frontage has been permanently reserved, and you know what permanent means. At some date afterwards, along came various surveyors. Here we are in 1921, and here we are in 1907.
One of my early jobs.
One of your early jobs, good. Yes, and yes, you did very well. So here's freehold land that's been sold off. What's been left in between? Unreserved Crown land. Land which it does not have the protection, does not have the apparatus available through the Crown Land Reserves Act. It's just nothing land. It's just wasteland. If you were the manager of Britannia Creek, would you want your management efforts to be thwarted or constrained or by imaginary lines such as this on the cadastre? I doubt it very much. You would want to know where the freehold boundary is. You would want to know the boundary between the public land and the private land, but within the public land, is this of any meaning to you? Surely not. I think it's a major impediment to proper management.
Why was it crossed out?
Why was it crossed out? This goes back to the culture of the old Lands Department. We know the reason, and you don't. Right? It's for us to know and for you to find out.
Any questions?
And that's the way they thought, isn't it? Yes. It's because the Gazette of 1881 listed however many rivers it was. Now, one of the items on the list was the Yarra and all its tributaries. Right. Somebody read that and thought, hey, Britannia Creek is indeed a tributary of the Yarra. Therefore, there's a permanent reserve along it. Along came Silent Bright Spark in the Old Lands Department and said, hey, no, Britannia Creek is a tributary of the Watts River, which in turn is a tributary of the Yarra. So Britannia Creek is not a tributary of the Yarra. Get it? It's a tributary of a tributary. Therefore, the Gazette didn't apply. What would you and I have done in that situation? We would have put another notice in the Gazette, wouldn't we?
Of course.
Yes. Oh, not the Old Lands Department.
They just crossed it out.
That's right. They crossed it out. And a stroke of a pen, they imagined they were going to undo the permanent reserve. I am assured now by your colleague and mine, John Macy, that in fact this crossing out has been expunged and the permanent reserve has been reinstated along Britannia Creek.
Oh, that's good.
But it does illustrate an extremely weird mindset that used to drive the old Lands Department.
What do you mean used to?
Ask
Joe, you've got it there.
So does it go all out to sort of first order streams then, as far as within the Yarra?
It's my belief that when they put in the Gazette the Yarra and all its tributaries, they meant tributaries and tributaries of tributaries and everything.
Yeah, sure.
That is what they meant. Right? And if it came to a court case, I would be happy to engage a barrister to argue that. But no, the Old Lands Department, which relished complications such as you've just seen, thought the other way.
So they would have thought the catchment, any tributary or a stream within the catchment area.
That's what I believe it meant, yes. Permanently
Logical.
yeah. Now, the cross-section, and Rob showed us some diagrams of a cross-section. What is the bed and banks? Here's the definition out of the Land Act. Land over which water normally flows. How do you like that for a legal definition?
Fantastic.
Yeah, very nice. Now, is it important? It's a definition that hangs on this word normal. I'm sorry, there ain't such a thing as normal anymore, is there? Does it matter that it's such a rubbery sort of definition? Well, yes it does. Because what happened in 1881 was that the bed and banks plus one chain on the left side and 1.5 chains on the right side or whatever is permanently reserved. So the definition of bed and banks in turn determines the location and width and the outer edge of the permanent reserve. Why is that important? Because the freehold boundary may well be defined as the outer edge of the reserve. So abutting landowners, their boundary in many cases will be the outer edge of the reserve, which will be one chain from the bed and banks, which is land over which water normally flowed, past tense, in the year 1881.
You've got to get Kerry McCormick to the northeast to tell you.
You can see the sort of complications. Now, the waterways for the Water Act has a slightly different definition. When we're talking about waterways there, it includes the cross-section up to any defined lip. So we don't have to figure out where water normally flows, but we do have to figure out what is a defined lip. If it's the Murray, unique in our situation, the state border is actually at something called the top of the high bank. And every now and then surveyors are called out to actually stick pegs in the ground to define where the border is. Moving from statutory law to common law, we find something called the Doctrine of Accretion, which Rob mentioned earlier, which tells us that some boundaries, not all boundaries, some boundaries move around if the topographic feature moves around. They'll move only if the topographic feature has moved gradually and imperceptibly, not artificially or suddenly. This is a body of law that comes from England. It has very, very seldom been tested in Australian courts, and it's a long, long time since a court was asked to determine whether movement of the topographic feature was natural or artificial, and whether it was gradual or sudden. And frankly, I don't care what a court would have thought. You know, you can get a whole raft load of judges to examine this question, and I'm sorry, I'm not interested. I'm much more interested in practical, real-world methods of addressing issues such as rivers moving. Adverse possession is another little monster from the common law, which tells us that you don't necessarily own land that's on your title. You may in fact own land belonging to your neighbour, or your neighbour may indeed own land belonging to you. We'll have a look at an example in a minute. And let's forget about that one. Here we are, just north of Bacchus Marsh. Here's the Lerderderg of Bacchus Marsh. The buff-coloured areas are freehold land. The grey areas are Crown land, and the blue line through the middle is the actual river. What's going on here? The grey is the Crown land, basically when, from 1881, when we got the permanent reserve. The river of its own volition has decided to jump up and go somewhere else. Spare a thought for the owner of this parcel of land, right, who has the actual river running through the middle of it. Spare a thought for the person who thinks they own this piece of land, and when they come to subdivide it are told by the surveyor that they have a permanent Crown reserve through the middle of it. What's the meaning of permanent? You need an Act of Parliament to sort it out. Does it matter? I say yes, it does. It matters both to the landowners and to the agencies attempting to manage the river. 1905. Now, we talked about some particular titles going to the centre line of the river, and what happened in 1905 is that Parliament said, oh, we made a mistake. We shouldn't have issued the title to the centre line of the river. It's going to come back to the edge of the waterway. Did anybody go around the state and change all those titles? No, they didn't. And all over the place you'll find people who still believe they own to the centre line of the river. And amazingly, here in the 21st century, we find that these people who have the land taken off them in 1905 still have legal rights to the land that they no longer own. They have rights to take domestic and stock water and rights against trespassers. In fact, they have rights to put their cattle in the water. When you try and get stock out the waterways, I'm sorry, there's a whole bunch of people out there who have legally enforceable rights written into statute saying they are allowed to put their cattle in that water. That is the legacy of 1905.
There's cattle there to crap in the water while they're
there. Indeed. The law is actually silent on the subject of crap in the water. By necessary implication, yes, that does follow. Now, yes, thinking of stock in waterways, you would imagine that there's a whole body of law waiting to be employed to help us remove stock from waterways. Let's have a look at some of it. The Impounding of Livestock Act, no use at all. Fences Act, no use at all. Crown Land Reserves Act could possibly help because there is a head of power there for regulations, but no such regulations have been made. The Land Act, no power for regulations even. And, as I was saying before, the Land Act actually writes into statute the fact that these 1905 owners have legally enforceable rights to put their cattle in the water. Water Act, we know, has provision for bylaws, but there's no bylaws on this particular subject. The common law of trespass does not apply to Crown land, and we might head off to the Environment Protection Authority complaining about crap in the waterways. I'm sorry, they're not interested, because stock in the waterways is not, in their terms, a scheduled activity. So here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 attempts that we make to find a head of power to help us deal with cattle in the waterways, and they are all ineffective. Now, how are we going to fix things up? How does Parliament fix things up? One thing Parliament does is just recycle old acts, and as Rob said, the Land Act 1958 is the successor of a series of other acts dating back to 1869, and in fact great slabs of the 1869 Act still appear today in the Land Act 1958. It was not written in 1958, it was merely regurgitated in 1958. Another thing Parliament does is stick patches onto existing acts, and very often it sticks patches onto the patches. The Land Act, 121 amendments since 58, Crown Land Reserves Act, 102 since 1978. Subordinate legislation is something that Parliament doesn't make itself, but authorises, and we'll come to that in a minute if we may. Parliament will also make spot acts. Here's a here's one little piece of land, here's one problem that needs to be fixed, right, we'll have an act to do it. University Square, just up the road here, needed a car park underneath it. That's a permanent reserve, it couldn't be done otherwise, it's got its own special act of Parliament. What's that? Yeah. You've already parked there, are you? Under University Square?
Not telling.
No, right. Now, what interests me though is this bottom drop point here, that now and then Parliament does look at new umbrella acts that spread across the whole body of law and impinge on or supersede or override various other acts. And two that are just worth looking at tonight are the Coastal Management Act and the Road Management Act. Now, in the paper that Peter Goldberg and I did, we looked at three possibilities for riparian legislation. Number one, wait until all these various acts come up before Parliament for some other reason and then do something with them. Well, a useful strategy. Number two, an Omnibus Reform Act which amends all the various acts we've talked about, sorts them all out and is then written out of existence. Number three, a standalone act, not unlike the Coastal Management Act or the Road Management Act. And what I concluded in 2008 was that the first one was useless, the second one was the way we ought to go, and the third one I wasn't so sure about. I must say that as I stand here tonight, I'm more favourably disposed to the third one. We've seen the Coastal Management Act, we've seen the Road Management Act, and why not have a Riparian Management Act sorting out all the stuff that we've just been talking about. What does the Coastal Management Act do? Well, it sorted out a few things which weren't working well. It set up some new bodies. It set up a hierarchy of plans. And it left most of the other coastal-related legislation untouched. So it sat there sort of on top of the other legislation. Whether it's worked well or not, well, you have to go up to coastal managers to ask them. The Road Management Act, the impetus for it was a specific problem with a High Court case. You're winding me up.
I am standing up.
So the Road Management Act resolved the specific problem and went on to sort out a bundle of other little problems which various road authorities had built up over the decades. What we're left with is this umbrella act which sits on top of other road-related acts such as the Road Safety Act. Subordinate legislation also needs to be fixed, and in our the 2008 paper we looked at some ways in which that might happen. If we are to have a Riparian Land Reform Act, then this is what it might do. It would sort out the problems with the Land Act. It would sort out the problems with the Crown Land Reserves Act. It would use existing legislation to provide a statutory basis for give and take fence lines and status neutral agreements. Right, we want an agreement relating to a water frontage. Half of it's Crown land and half of it is freehold land. There is no apparatus to do that as things stand. SKM advocated that back in 2000, and it's still not on the books. The Water Act, let's get rid of this domestic and stock watering rights nonsense. Let's sort out what the 1905 bunch of landowners should and should not have as statutory rights. All your water authorities, we know about designated waterways, we know what they are, but what on earth is designated land? Is a power that sits in your Act which has never been used. Let's sort it out. Oh, is it? Right. What's never been used? Now, here's a slide which you might imagine is put up in the interests of comic relief.
Weekly
Times. Weekly Times, 2008. This was in response to the paper I've been talking about, and I put this up in deadly serious because in any reform of riparian legislation, the Victorian Farmers Federation must be on board as a partner.
Get into bed with them, David.
That's right. Get in your terminologies, get into bed with them, right? Yeah. And at the same time, let's fix up a bunch of other acts. There we are, that I've talked about just before. And as we speak, we're looking at the draft Victorian Waterway Management Strategy. And what does it say? Goodness me, what a mouthful of nonsense this is. Look at it. Review legislation relating to the management of riparian land, particularly Crown land, focusing on the Land Act. Oh, look, that sentence could have been written 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago. Have we come no further than rewriting the same sentence that Grandpa could have written 50 years ago? One thing that's in this strategy that is a move forward is Action 9.7, which, here we are, says that there'll be a better way of alerting buyers of freehold property to the fact that they are also taking over a Crown water frontage, which has just not been available to them up until now. So, are we moving ahead? If we are, it's extremely slowly.
Imperceptibly.
That's right, gradually and imperceptibly. That's right.
Bundalong,
And
Williams Island, Ovens River.
That's right, junction of the Ovens and the Moe,
Yep.
and
Thank you.
and these particular photos are courtesy of University of Melbourne. Thank you
Great
very
picture.
much. Yeah.